Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve McLeod, and I am the president of the Coastal Society, as well as an environmental scientist for the consulting firm WSP. Thank you for joining this session of TCS's Coastal Connections web conferencing series. The trending topic we will cover is coastal communities and offshore wind development, challenges and opportunities. Note that the session is being recorded and will be made available in the coming days. For our non-member guests, the Coastal Society is a nonprofit organization founded in 1975 with a mission of fostering dialogue and advancing education to promote the wise use of our coastal resources. You can learn more about the Society and become a member at www.thecoastalsociety.org, presented on the screen in front of you. The Coastal Connection series is meant to better connect TCS members and guests from the coastal community throughout the year. Our intent is not only to be educated by our excellent guest presenters, but also to see and hear from you, our other participants. During the Q&A discussion to follow, we do ask you then to turn on your camera and speak up when you have a question. Note that we have a scheduled 1-hour session, but some of our presenters have agreed to remain on the line a bit longer if the conversation is flowing. Special thanks to Ashley Gordon and Melanie Perello for their support in organizing and running this session. In the spirit of matching names and faces, especially for the sake of other TCS members on the line, I will quickly invite some of the TCS board members that are with us today to introduce themselves, mention where they're at and their profession if they have it. So I see Judy is on the line. Judy, would you like to unmute and introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. This is Judy Tucker. I'm in Williamsburg, Virginia, and I am the support staff for the Coastal Society and have been for a number of years. It's great to have you all participate. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Judy. Gino, are you on the line? All right. How about Chris? No, that's fine. How about Tom? I do see you.
Yep, I'm here. Tom Bigford. I've been a board member for off and on for the last couple of decades. Now I'm on the board as a director and retired from NOAA and retired from the American Fisheries Society, but very involved in TCS activities.
Thanks. Ashley, you're obviously on the line.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashley Gordon, and I'm also on the board of directors. I live in Virginia Beach, and I'm a coastal analyst with the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission.
Thanks, Ashley. Any other board members on the line right now?
I suppose I should pop up as the ex-president of the Coastal Society, Mike Orbach, retired professor from Duke University. With respect to this exercise, I'm currently serving as the chair of the National Academy of Science Standing Committee on Offshore Science and Assessment that advises BOEM on science related to offshore energy, including renewable energy.
Okay, thanks, Mike. We'll get to other participants' credentials in the Q&A session, but if there are no current other board members, then I am happy to introduce our moderator for today's session, Jen McCann. She's the director of the U.S. Coastal Programs at the University of Rhode Island and director of extension programs for Rhode Island Sea Grant. Jen.
Great, thank you, Steve, and thank you for this opportunity to moderate such an important topic. And clearly we could be talking about this topic for days if we really wanted to. So again, this is a 60-minute session. As Steve said, many of us will stay on afterwards, but I will make an announcement after the 60 minutes to recognize that we have officially ended the formal part of this panel. Each panelist will present for about 10 minutes. I will give each panelist about a 1-minute warning, and we encourage you to hold your questions until the end. You're welcome to, however, include your questions in the chat box. We'll be looking at that. And also, if appropriate, we will ask you to unmute and ask your question as well. So with that, we're going to start with the panel. First panelist is Mike Snyder. He's the Ocean and Great Lakes Program Manager for New York State Department of Office of Planning, Development, and Community Infrastructure. So Mike, Thanks for being here. If you want to share your screen and your face, love to see you.
Great. Thank you, Jen. And hopefully everybody is seeing my PowerPoint. Is that right?
Yes.
Perfect. I'm a little technologically, I don't know what the word is. I'm learning, let's just say that way, even a year in on our pandemic here. So I just want to say a big thank you to the Coastal Society for inviting me to talk today. As Jen said, I'm the Ocean and Great Lakes Program Manager in the New York Department of State. For those who don't know, we are the home to the State Coastal Management Program. So there are a lot of familiar faces and voices on the line today. So it's really great to be here. And we're talking about a topic that I've been a part of ever since coming to New York a little over a decade ago, which is offshore wind development. And I think it's particularly important to think about offshore wind development in the context of community impacts. But what does that really mean? You know, it's such a huge topic. I kind of struggled for a while thinking about how to best pin it down. And what I arrived at is, you know, you really can't. And I think that's the part of today's talk that I think we're going to continue to come back to, which is this is complex. And the complexity is not just in the type of project that's being developed, it's in how that project is received, how that project is understood, and ultimately how it impacts communities at all types of different levels. So I wanted to just start by kind of briefly talking about what we mean by community. I think it's a word that we all kind of bandy about, you know, for different reasons, and can mean a lot of different things. And there's a lot of ways of defining community, but I thought I would just pick a few that made sense within the context of offshore wind. You know, we certainly have communities that are more at the neighborhood scale. And I don't know about others, but that's certainly what I always think of first when I think of community. Who do I live near? Who are the people that I interact with on a daily basis? But obviously, we also have communities that we're part of because of our jobs or because of an interest or a passion that we have. In the coastal context, that can be a fishing community. It can be a navigation community. It can be a community of people who you know, just have a shared passion for the ocean or a shared passion for recreation. So that associative community, I think, is really important because it helps define our interest in something like offshore wind. And then lastly, we have a governance type of community. So, you know, we are all at some level governed by an entity, if not multiple entities. And that makes us part of a community, whether we are participating in a permit review, whether we're taxpayers at a local or a state level. That type of community is also very important in terms of the context of offshore wind. Now, clearly, these communities have some overlap. You know, we're members, each of us, in different types of communities. They also exist at different scales. And I think that scale issue is one that makes offshore wind particularly complex and challenging because we have communities of these different types at different scales. We have governance at different scales. We have communities of association at different scales. And we even have proximity communities at different scales. And I think that scale issue is one, again, that we'll talk about a little bit more throughout this afternoon's conversation. Sorry, my computer's being a little finicky here. All right, so first off, offshore wind is a regional issue. From the New York perspective, we see 26 gigawatts of offshore wind potential development just within our region, and that region is roughly from Rhode Island down to Virginia. From a regional perspective, we certainly appreciate that offshore wind projects, while sited off of one state, may very well be transmitting electricity to a different state. And I think this is part of the growth and understanding of offshore wind as a complex and regional scale type of issue continues to evolve. We know we just saw in New York here with our latest procurement, projects off of Rhode Island and Massachusetts proposing what previously were kind of unheard of lengths of transmission coming into the New York energy market. So again, increasingly offshore wind project development can be thought of as a regional scale issue. What does that mean for communities? This is another one from a state perspective that I think has been especially challenging because we're not used to thinking of it from an interstate level. We're not used to thinking of our commercial fishermen in New York or our navigation community at much more than maybe a bi-state or at most a tri-state type of level. So when we start thinking about the regional communities of fishermen or of navigation interests, we need to think more broadly. In fact, the area off of New York has fishermen from the entire East Coast pretty much. If they can steam here, they'll fish here. And I think that poses a real challenge for us from a state level as we think about how to both understand and then ultimately address those impacts to those communities at the regional scale. And then obviously those regional communities are dependent on ecosystem scale processes and habitats, things like migratory pathways that, again, our understanding and knowledge continues to evolve. We continue to see new connections and new ways that those types of communities can be impacted by offshore wind development. The offshore wind, I'm here because it's clearly a state issue. In New York, we have very aggressive targets for emissions reductions. And I think it's really important for us to understand that that's true, not just in New York, but in other states around us. Certainly from New York, with some of our nation leading goals, that leads to a very large target for offshore wind. We have a 9 gigawatt target by 2035 to achieve in New York. I'm happy to say we're well on our way, although still far to go. We have about 4,300 megawatts of offshore wind capacity in active development. So thinking about offshore wind from a state perspective, and then multiplying that across the regional scale, I think you can, again, start to see how this becomes a very complex and very large type of endeavor. Thinking about the challenges and opportunities then, and again, going just at the state scale, certainly those same communities that we saw at the regional level still apply. They still hold at the state scale. And in fact, some of them and some of the conversations are really driven by those state level concerns. But at the same time, there's certainly a state level of community that exists, and particularly in New York, where we have our own electrical grid, that's separate from that regional scale conversation. What's important for us, not only in terms of our emissions reductions and offshore wind development goals, is also figuring out how that fits into the state electrical grid, how ultimately that impacts the state ratepayers. And then particularly important to us, how that can manifest in terms of economic benefits and job opportunities to the state from that offshore wind development. So again, from a state scale, we see things not only at the regional level filtering down, but we also see additional challenges and opportunities that the state itself needs to pay particular attention to. And then finally, offshore wind is a local issue. At the local scale, offshore wind has very specific siting requirements, and New York is really just starting to appreciate those firsthand as our first transmission line, the South Fork Wind Export Cable, is going through the permitting process. What those local community challenges are, I think, are not unfamiliar to many of us because we deal with them in our daily lives. Those impacts are related to not just the elements of all the other scales, but some of those very location specific, neighborhood specific, and municipal specific types of issues. Things that matter to people in their everyday lives, whether it's recreation and public access, whether it's air or noise or other nuisances, as well as issues that I think we're continuing to appreciate and understand in other contexts and how those manifest, such as equity issues, issues of environmental justice. From a municipal standpoint, certainly issues related to tax base are always important, as well as the overall character of our community and its sense of place. So those local challenges compound everything we experience at the regional and then the state level and add a unique flavor that has to be appreciated and addressed in its own way. So that's a lot, right? That's a lot for us to try to address and absorb. And it's a lot, not just for us, but it's a lot for the communities. From the community perspective, the technical nature, the volume of information, the long time scale of development, all of those things add up into a very complicated process with multiple steps, from planning to site assessment, to construction and operations, to draft EISs, to final EISs, to state level reviews. how is a community supposed to try to engage, and how are we supposed to engage a community so that they can provide the most meaningful input, and so that we can try to understand and to the best we can accommodate the issues that matter to them. I'm
Mike,
just
you
going
have
to walk
about
through
a
a
minute.
couple of strategies. Okay, thank you, Jen. I'll walk through quickly a couple of strategies that New York uses, and then again, this is going to be the focus of the rest of our conversation today. First, it's really critical to engage communities at multiple scales. So for example, on the left here, we see the Coast Guard has broken apart some of its navigation assessment activities into something between a regional and a state scale. The information that comes out of those types of processes can then be fed into information portals. Those information portals can be at a regional scale or they can be at a local scale. And what's important here is that we provide it in multiple ways, that we're doing this through multiple types of venues so that communities can intersect at the level that makes the most sense for them. We also want to try to focus on individual community aspects, so getting to those associations of communities. In New York, we have technical working groups that break communities apart based on the specific interests that they have. The Department of State's involved in a maritime technical working group where we're working with the commercial mariners to try to understand what matters to them across the suite of project development and the breadth of projects within the region. And then finally, we all know it's important to learn as we go. And as we start to work with communities, we start to see that needs change, communities change, they evolve over time, just as the project design evolves. So it's increasingly critical for us to embrace an evolutionary approach, to take an iterative approach, no matter what process we're part of, at what scale, and to appreciate that the community is on the journey with us. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I look forward to any questions you may have, and looking forward to the other presenters. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you, Mike. Really interesting. And I love the nested perspective. Really nice. So now we're going to go to Matt. Matt, I'm going to introduce you if you want to share your screen while I'm doing that. Matt Smith is the Director of Offshore Wind Business Development for the Hampton Roads Alliance. So Matt, are you good?
I'm good to go if you all can see my presentation here.
Yep, it looks great.
Great. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to talk to the group today, and I want to thank especially Ashley Gordon, my former coworker, for inviting me to speak. So as Jen said, I'm the Director of Offshore Wind for the Hampton Roads Alliance. And I want to tell you a little bit about our organization because I think it is important to the context of this conversation about impacts and why communities think that offshore wind, especially the offshore wind supply chain, is important. So I work for a regional economic development organization, and our mission is to grow the economy of Hampton Roads at the most basic level. And we think that the offshore wind as an industry new to the US and one that needs a whole new supply chain is important enough to warrant our organization establishing a dedicated initiative around building the offshore wind supply chain in Hampton Roads. So that's our main goal, to build that supply chain. And then some ancillary goals we have around that are to attract new investment to the Commonwealth of Virginia, primarily from Europe right now, as that's where most of the capacity in the offshore wind industry is. But we also want to grow Virginia businesses. A lot of businesses in the region are familiar with processes, and what they do is relevant to the maritime ecosystem and can fit into that supply chain, we think. So we want to make sure that they're able to take advantage of that opportunity. And ultimately, we want to create long-term and high-wage jobs for the residents of our region. And so we wouldn't be doing this unless we thought it made good sense. And we do think it makes sense because of some of the advantages or assets that Virginia has. If you know the Hampton Roads area a little bit, we really have some unmatched port infrastructure on the East Coast, both state-owned facilities and just private terminals throughout the rivers in our area. We also have the largest maritime workforce in the country. We have more shipbuilders in the country and more than any other state on the East Coast. So we feel that those workers are well skilled and appropriately skilled to transition into the offshore wind industry. And then some things that kind of just make sense in that we have sites for the supply chain in a business climate we think is friendly to the industry. So Mike talked a little bit about the process of siting and building an offshore wind project, and it's lengthy. This is a slide that BOEM uses, and it really starts in the identification of a wind energy area. And some of those charts that Mike used kind of explain some of the things that are taken into consideration when those areas are identified. You really want to know about who your ocean users are and make sure that those wind energy areas fit with those users and don't overly burden them. And then you have processes that are related to site assessment and surveys that take up to 5 years, and then some technical review. And then finally, you get to the manufacturing of the components, the construction of the project, and then the operation of the project, which can be running for up to over 25 years. And those interim steps of manufacturing and construction can take up to 3 years apiece. So it's a really long game in offshore wind. This is a slide that I stole from an Ørsted presentation. They're a major developer out of Denmark. But I think it does and I think they stole it from somebody else, so I don't feel too bad about that. But it does a great job of kind of explaining all that goes on in the development and construction and operation of an offshore wind project, all in one slide. And so I'm going to walk you through it just from left to right. So it starts with that siting and development process where really you're assessing whether a site is appropriate for a project, the types of conditions that are at the site, both on the seafloor, in the ocean. You want to assess the environmental impacts and really determine the environment for the project, and that feeds into the type of project you're going to design. You know, what type of foundation you may use or how to site your turbines. So eventually, you're going to submit a construction and operations plan to BOEM, which will get reviewed and approved after about 2 years, and you're ready to build your project. So right now, most of the components of the project are going to be coming from Europe. That's where the supply chain capacity is. And I'll just walk you quickly through what those components are at the highest level. There's a foundation that is seated into the seafloor. On top of that, there is a tower, and now those towers can be really 800 feet high. I was able to visit the test turbines that are off the coast of Virginia, and those are actually taller than the tallest building in Virginia. So you have attached to that the nacelle, which houses the generating facility, the blades, and then the cables, which a lot of people don't think about, but they connect each turbine to each other and then to substations, which then run onshore to an onshore substation, so you can eventually get that power into the grid. And then there is an assortment of vessels that are needed to construct the project. So that third phase is the construction and installation phase, and that's where ports and vessels come into play. So every developer is looking for a port facility where they can do certain things. A lot of it has to do with staging and pre-assembly. Since these components are typically coming from somewhere else, they need to be staged and assembled to the greatest extent possible onshore, because it's safer and cheaper to do that. Eventually, when the supply chain moves to the US, which it's anticipated to do because of the size of the market, there will probably be some fabrication of those port facilities as well. And the process of installing these turbines is begun, and they require some specialized vessels, and that's one of the bottlenecks that the industry sees right now as a kind of an impediment to developing that 30 gigawatt pipeline that's off the coast of the US. There's a series of vessels that feed the projects, the components, and then the heavy lift vessels that actually install them. And there's a law called the Jones Act that constrains the supply of those vessels, because if they want to move between 2 points in the US, those vessels have to be built in the US and crewed by US mariners. So actually, there is no wind installation vessel that exists in the United States that's US flagged. Dominion Energy is building the first one right now in Brownsville, Texas. So It's really an important part of this industry that's being addressed. And then finally, you have the operations and maintenance of a wind farm that's going to be operating for about 25 years. And they require a lot of planned and then probably some also unplanned and emergency maintenance. So there's two ways that the technicians are getting out to maintain these turbines. One, through crew transfer vessels that will run from shore close by to the turbines. And then there are also what's called a service operation vessel, which is essentially a floating hotel, which stays on site and allows technicians to maintain the turbines. And if I remember correctly, in our discussions with Dominion Energy, they expect to go out to each turbine in their project 14 times per year, and they're going to be 180 turbines in that project. So it's a major undertaking. And then I'll just go over what we call Virginia's projects. So those are the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project, which is being built by Dominion Energy, and the Kitty Hawk Offshore Wind Project, which is actually off the coast of North Carolina, but will be served out of Hampton Roads, being built by Avangrid Renewables. And those are both about 2,500 megawatt projects. Just for some context, the Hoover Dam is a 2,000 megawatt generating facility. So these are really massive generating facilities and massive projects. So I'll quickly go through some of the impacts that the projects have, since that's the focus of our talk today, both environmental and economic impacts. So at a rough level, these two projects are going to be able to provide enough power, clean power, to 1.4 million homes. They'll also remove about 10 million tons of CO2 emissions, or will avoid 10 million tons of CO2 emissions, which is the equivalent of planting about 160 million trees or taking 2 million non-electric vehicles off the road every year. And so what we're most interested in at the Alliance is the economic impact, not just of the construction of the projects, but really hosting the supply chain in Hampton Roads that can serve projects all the way up to New York that you saw on some of Mike's slides. So both of these projects have had economic impact studies done for them. So we anticipate just during the construction phase about 650 jobs, those will be over that period of construction, and then about 2,000 jobs, permanent jobs to operate these turbines. And we also, as part of the economic impact study for the CVAL project, estimated how many jobs would be created if Hampton Roads supported 1 gigawatt of installation per year on the East Coast. And that would roughly translate into a boost to our economy of 5,200 jobs. So it's a pretty big deal.
You have about a minute.
Thank you. Great, thank you. And then the final point I'll make is that there's some numbers in these. Both of these studies are available online, and they estimate the direct and indirect impacts of the project, and combined, just in construction, these projects will have over a $1.4 billion impact on the regional economy. So I'm happy to answer questions when we're through with the other presenters' presentations. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. And Laurie, why don't you put your slides up and I will introduce you. So we have Laurie Kutina, who's an environmental scientist at WSP. So Laurie, take it away.
Laurie, you're on mute right
Laurie, you're on mute. Yeah. You doing okay with your slides? Okay, we see them. Great. You're on mute.
Someone with a barking dog should mute.
Yeah, that's me. I'm trying to.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. Thank you. So, and hopefully you can see it's kind of funny, just like Mike, I'm trying to figure out which ones you get. And you're not looking at my picture of my family. You're actually looking at the slides.
We're seeing the orange slide with your cover. Yep.
Excellent. That's good, because that would have been embarrassing. Okay. I think, Mike and Matt definitely did cover, a lot of the general information about how these things get permitted, I think definitely some of the scale and how far along they are. I think, what the area that I wanted to kind of focus on is the environmental impacts of them. And it does start, as Mike was talking about with the role of government and the fact that these are such large projects. This isn't a local issue. And you have a lot of people that are involved at different levels of the community that need to participate in the whole process and help with this process. So as both Mike and Matt mentioned, on the federal level, the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, BOEM, is responsible for an awful lot of the development and planning that goes into these projects. And then in terms of assessing those impacts, these are some of the other federal agencies that also get involved. And for the most part, BOEM is responsible for that National Environmental Protection Act documentation, which is NEPA. If you're familiar, I'm sure this audience is very familiar with NEPA, but it's, when federal actions are implemented, making sure that they meet all the requirements in terms of environmental impact, and that you also are communicating that information, which again is one of those things that's extremely important to communities, is that so that they understand what those impacts will be and what the benefits will be, so that they can make good decisions. And those are decisions that need to be made on, because of these large projects on many different levels. Again, the state, Mike works with the Department of State, NYSERDA is involved, the Department of Environmental Protection is involved. The state of New York, where I work primarily, has a lot of agencies that are also involved at the different levels. And then, back to the idea of the local role, a lot of these pieces, as Matt was talking about, will end up onshore at some point. And there's a bunch of different ways that they will, but a lot of it is in terms of jobs, in terms of construction, equipment and business and impacts. So those are other areas that also need to be considered. And as Mike was talking about it, there's a lot of different areas ways that New York is getting involved in it right now. Looking at there's wind at many different stages of development in New York, and definitely New York has a very ambitious schedule for what they want to achieve. And because of the goals that have been established to make sure that renewable energy is a huge part of New York moving forward. So the New York Offshore Wind Master Plan, one of the purposes of putting this together several years ago at this point is to make sure that all those environmental impacts are considered. And I'm not going to go through this, but just that's the list of all the studies that were completed as a part of the master plan. And that first initial 2,400 megawatts that the state wanted to get out, making sure that there was a lot of study that was completed up front, and that will continue as we go through those phases and changes, as Mike mentioned. In terms of some of the biggest benefits, obviously, from the wind is air quality. I mean, the wind turbines, there's zero emissions. They don't burn fossil fuels. As Matt mentioned, there's a significant amount of savings in terms of avoided greenhouse gas emissions when we don't have to burn fossil fuels. And it always depends on what community you're talking about, what the mix of fuels that are being used at the time are within the communities that are receiving the energy from these projects. But definitely, these are a huge part of New York and the United States plans for really getting off fossil fuels and reducing those greenhouse gases. You can't underestimate, you can't think about how much impact these can have, as Matt was mentioning. I mean, these are huge projects. They're going to provide a lot of energy where it's needed. I think, one of the most exciting things is the idea that a lot of this power will be serving New York City and Long Island, because right now a lot of the peaker plants that serve these areas are run by natural gas. And so in New York, one of the things I'm proud of is over the course of my career, we don't have any coal burning generators anymore, but we do have an awful lot of natural gas, and we burn an awful lot of that in the New York City metropolitan area and on Long Island when we have peaker situations where we need extra electricity. And these offshore wind turbines are definitely going to reduce those impacts, which will directly improve air quality in neighborhoods. So, back again to the local impacts of these projects, this is where you definitely will see some improvement in the communities that have these gas facilities, and you will see air quality benefits from these projects. Again, as Mike and Matt were talking about the different types of communities and what they care about, definitely I think in terms of environmental impacts, whether it's the community of the local towns and villages that are near the projects, or those that care about the environment and care about wildlife, for whether it's emotional or economic reasons, continuing to have those environmental review of the development is going to be necessary. As Matt, I loved your presentation of, this is the operations of, how it goes from planning all the way to maintenance. And that's also going to be mirrored by the environmental reviews and environmental assessments. Those things, making sure that those impacts that from these projects that we have some idea of how those impacts will affect the environment from other locations, but we're starting to learn how it will affect the United States coast. One of the areas that I actually do a lot of work in is visibility, and I think it is something that everyone's going to have their own opinion of, and it becomes very interesting to figure out. There's some people who love them and there's some people who hate them, but I think there's a science to figuring out what those impacts are going to be. And I've actually worked for about almost 2 decades on large-scale renewables onshore. So looking at the impacts, as people see them up close, and those opinions of whether they like them or not, with these things that are so big and so close, they're going to be big, and so they're going to be hard to deal with if they're in your immediate community. Offshore has an interesting twist, which is it's very far away, and you have a lot of things that affect it. One of my favorites is the curvature of the Earth actually having a huge effect on whether they're visible. This is one of my favorite things about this, is that if you get far enough out, you're only going to see the tops of those turbines. And I think in New York, the projects are going to be between 14 to 20 miles out. And so, and some people might say, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to see them. Or the majority of them. So you're going to have a situation where they're not going to be particularly visible. And this is different than onshore, as I was mentioning, because a lot of times there's mitigation, there's some offsets where, there's different things that are done for onshore projects that probably won't happen here for visibility reasons. So, but it is interesting to be able to see what they might be looking like. And hopefully this one worked. I was having trouble with this, but here's my colleague Steve McLeod took this picture in Brighton, England, And this is actually a shot of the Rampion offshore wind project, which is in the English Channel, and it's about 8 to 12 miles offshore. So, so I think one of the interesting things, and if you've ever been to some of the coastal areas, maybe what Matt was talking about down in Virginia, you know, that have big ports, I think the visibility of the ships coming in and out, that you're going to notice, that you're always going to see that. You're not compared to that in terms of scale. Your ships are much bigger, and you will be able to see them. But in terms of what they, you know, the scale of them is not what we're used to for onshore facilities.
Laurie, you got a little bit less than a minute.
Okay. So just some of the, I just wanted to, I don't want anybody to have to read this, but I thought it might be something to be useful if you had the slide decks afterwards. It's just, you know, these are all the things, I think Matt and Mike also talked about this, is all the things they're going into making sure that these facilities are looked at and planned with the community in their thoughts, and in getting all the information to the communities and to the people that are involved in the development process, so that the very good decisions can be made. I think, you know, definitely making sure that all these things that we've been talking about here, the environmental, the social, and the economic impacts are all going to, they're going to skew people's opinions of these things. And so it really is important to get as much information out to stakeholders as possible, and so that they can make good decisions. And so rather than knee-jerk decisions about based on what they look like, or, you know, what their opinions are, and make sure that they get good facts about what they actually will provide. And just quickly, this is one of the places that you can get more information about. You can sign up for email updates, and, you know, everybody can Google these days. It's, you know, there's a lot of information out there, and continuously comes out from the agencies like Mike's and like Matt's that do these projects. And that's my presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Laurie. That was really interesting. And I wasn't going to do this, but you inspired me to put my background, which shows Black Island from the mainland, and it's about 13 miles off. And this is, you know, again, we get a lot of foggy days up here in Rhode Island, so many times you can't see it, but at times you can. So that's what it looks like on a nice day. I'm gonna Mike, who is part of the Coastal Society, so he has a question. Mike, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a panelist your question?
Sure. Again, this is Mike Orbach. I'm asking this as with my hat on as the chair of this National Academy Committee that advises BOEM on production and use of science in all offshore development, including renewable. I'm interested, maybe I'll direct this to Mike Snyder first. How do you think the requirements for the kinds of science that should be done at the various stages of the process, how will that shift as we shift more and more from fossil fuel to and other hard minerals to renewable offshore energy development? Well, one obvious example is less emphasis on spill impacts and more emphasis on long-term presence impacts such as avian impacts. How do you think the science program may shift as we go more into the renewables, in particular wind?
Thanks. That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I think, you know, one of the key differences and challenges for BOEM is that wind is just a different animal than oil and gas in a lot of respects, and they're kind of, you know, coming at it from a lot of experience, decades of experience from a resource extraction. And yes, there is a resource extraction element to offshore wind, but from a footprint standpoint, from an operation standpoint, it has a lot of different nuances, a lot of different complexities. And I think you're absolutely right that some of the challenges in terms of the science are because of that scale of the footprint and because of the type of development. You're talking about, multiple dozens of structures above the water rather than one. You're talking about multiple dozens of structures below the water and making impact with the sediment. So I think there's sort of the near term, there's the midterm, and then there's the long term science needs. And I think it's not just about sort of that site specific rather, but some of those regional scale impacts as well. That's the stuff that I find most interesting. How will 30 years from now, 40 years from now.
Just make one more comment.
Sure.
Although this is a regional, it has a regional focus at this point, I can tell you that BOEM and our committee are clearly looking for the expansion of this kind of energy development in the Gulf and the Pacific as well. And they're going to have a little trouble, in my estimation, gearing up because their mindset is so much in BOEM on fossil fuels.
Yeah, it's a shift. It's a shift in thinking about the challenges, and one of the things that I think we're increasingly looking for that maybe hasn't been as emphasized as much because it hasn't been as necessary is some of the long-term monitoring. There's so many questions about project development that can only be answered when you have a project. And there's a lot of chicken and egg discussion that happens about what do we really need to know before we can go forward and know what we really need to know. And I think integrating the monitoring and the research back into the project siting and development is the really critical part. We talk a lot about monitoring and its importance for kind of its own sake, for research sake, but using that to then reinforce and better inform the future siting and future development, I think is really key. The other challenge is going to be the pace of technology change, which is just so far above what I ever expected in the last 10 years. We never thought we would see within the span that we've been working on it, sort of these almost exponential increases in capacity generation rather than simply mathematical or simple addition. It's just trying to keep up with the technology and the pace of change so that the research stays on top of the game and even ahead of the game is going to be a real challenge.
Great, thank you. We're going to go to the next question, which is directed at Laurie. Laurie, Kim Grubert noticed that you have some GHG mitigation estimates on your slides. So her question to you is the full life cycle of the wind turbine, for example, emissions due to production and decommissioning, reflected in the estimates for mitigated greenhouse gas emissions?
That's a great question. And I do not believe that the estimates that were used looked at life cycle. I know there have been other assessments that have looked at it. I can tell you from the experience that I've had with onshore is that it is a very small percentage, because when you're looking at, even if you're looking at an area like New York State, where in general we're looking at it, the greenhouse gas savings compared to our entire New York ISO numbers, which are pretty low compared to other states even, you're still seeing a significant reduction in greenhouse gases from that year to year for that whole 25 years of operations where you are not burning any fossil fuels. So it's an excellent question, because I think a lot of life cycle assessments have not been incorporated into all of those evaluations. What happens to the equipment afterwards? What does it take to develop it? And while most of the time it's because you're not using the extraction and the burning of fossil fuels in themselves have that life cycle that is over what a lot of the renewable projects will be, but it's something that should also be part of that equation.
Great, thank you. I'm going to direct a question to Matt. Matt, Given that your one of your major responsibilities is the supply chain, do you feel that Virginia can handle the whole supply chain of offshore renewable energy, or are you thinking of taking a regional approach? How do you divvy up the pie, and what is the community when you're talking about supply chain?
Sure. No, it's a great question. And that there's kind of a race among states along the East Coast to attract the supply chain from Europe to the United States. And the general rule of thumb is that when we're installing 1 gigawatt per year off our coast, those moves will happen. And I think so. I'll speak generally first in that it's most likely that the less technical parts of the supply chain will move to the U.S. first. So things like constructing foundations and the towers, and then the more technical components will move later on, such as the actual like generating facilities themselves. Virginia in our region is really blessed with a lot of we have 4 state port facilities just in our region alone, and one can be dedicated just to offshore wind, and it's over 200 acres. And we have a lot of other industrial sites that are appropriate. So I think we can handle a large range of the supply chain, but there are constraints because certain types of components can only be sited in certain areas because of overhead restrictions or depth of water requirements. So I think that we're situated to handle probably as much as we want, but are under heavy competition with areas like New York, which do have a heavier density of projects. And I don't recall the second part of your question. Maybe you can remind me about that.
Just the community. What is the community when you think of the supply chain? How
Sure.
big is the community?
Good. Okay. Yeah, I'm glad. Thank you. Yeah. And I'll take that to mean like what sorts of kind of occupations are expected as part of these projects. And it really runs the gamut from, engineers to design projects, to our waterfront workers, to people, tradesmen that are constructing projects, and kind of depending on what portions of the supply chain that we attract. But I often give a presentation with a gentleman from Dominion Energy, and he gives an example that their project will have 180 elevators 27 miles offshore that need to go up 90 stories. And so they're going to be elevator technicians that are going to be working offshore that are needed and trained for that sort of thing. So it's really a whole new game.
Great. Okay, Mike, I'm going to give you a tough question. It's Friday afternoon. I'm sure you're ready for it.
I'm ready.
Okay, here's a question that was asked on the effects of offshore wind development on the fishing communities and the reduction of catch. Can you talk a bit about the reduction in catch potentially offset by mitigation? So can you talk a little bit about the fishing industry and some of the mitigation activities that are ongoing to respond to that community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. It's been a great question for over a decade. I'll never forget one of the first meetings I went to was a group of Mid-Atlantic utilities, and I was like the coastal guy who got it dragged along. And they, I'm not going to say which state it was, but the head of the utility commission got up and said, we need offshore wind, and it's going to be easy because you know what? Nobody lives there. And it's not like putting lines through people's backyards. It's going to be a piece of cake. I think what we didn't appreciate, and I mean the royal we, not just those of us in the coastal community, was how big the ocean is and how small the ocean is. And I think the size of the ocean depends on what you're doing. And for fishermen, the ocean can actually be quite small. There's a lot of activity. New York, something I discovered is that New York is a place people like to come, not just to go shopping and sightseeing, but to fish. We kind of host a lot of the regional fishing activity. There's a lot of fish stocks offshore. There's some very commercially valuable fish stocks offshore. And here's the kicker, they're not necessarily New Yorkers fishing there. And so from a state perspective, our mitigation efforts have to, clearly focus on our state interests, but they can't be blind to those larger regional interests. And so I think what we have been trying to do and continue to try to do through things like the technical working groups that I mentioned is engage at that regional scale, identify the different types of uses, try to kind of break the problem down into, is this a gear type issue, with concerns about snags? Is this just a straight up access issue? I just can't even get my stuff in that project. And then are there different types of design or different types of project approaches that could be really tailored to meet some of those needs? So I think mitigation has to really be balanced with kind of the overarching project design, the project envelope, if you will, and all the other competing needs that go into it. But I would say access is always the number one that comes up. And once you get access, then it's about really, are there certain things we can do in terms of layout and configuration? We've seen some really kind of ingenious things happening in New England where some of the developers really took the reins on some of those conversations and started thinking about how they could orient their layout in ways that was going to be less impactful to the fishing community. So I think we just have to really be flexible and appreciate that the fishing community is not monolithic. There are many different types of fishing gear. There are many different types of stocks. And we have to just try to tailor those approaches suitably. And we have to work with our partners in the other states.
Great, thank you. The next question goes to Laurie from Jim Ballard. Jim, do you want to ask this question, or I guess I'll ask it, and please say something if you'd like. So Jim, what range of energy loss, this is for Laurie, what range of energy losses can occur for these projects, and how does that affect the ability to offset greenhouse gas emissions compared with other renewable energy options?
Actually, if you would like to open up your mic and clarify on that question, because I think, I guess what you're asking is in terms of the efficiency of getting the power from offshore to the facilities onshore and into the grid. I think that if that's your question.
Jim Ballard, would you mind unmiking and asking the question or clarifying it, please?
So,
okay.
So
Let's
maybe he's
assume
having
that.
questions.
Let's
Okay.
assume.
Well, I think, and actually Mike
that
might be, Mike Snyder might have some thoughts on this as well. But I think, wind capacity on its own is definitely, it is a lower in terms of the rated capacity versus the amount of wind that gets the electricity that actually gets to the grid. There are a lot of variables that are involved in that. Actually, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that because of the size of these systems and because of their ability to collect a lot more power and get that quickly to the grid, they're actually more efficient in terms of turning wind into power that can be used in people's houses than some of the more distributed large scale renewables that are on land, where you have where you do have a smaller amount of electricity that is flowing in, and the more electricity that you have flowing, and if you know this about your house and the number of your fuse box, and that if you have higher levels of voltage, it's more efficient. I'm probably getting that backwards. My husband always tells me I'm doing that backwards, but the point is that if you have more electricity coming in, it's more efficient to move it.
Okay.
So having these larger projects actually helps that.
Thank you. And just a reminder, there is a survey. Ashley Gordon just put it in the chat. Before you leave, if you could fill out this survey, and we would appreciate your feedback.
Jen, could I just add to Laurie's answer too? Because I think.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, certainly. And there's,
Before you
please.
answer, I just want to say that it is 5 o'clock. We're going to continue the conversation. And again, we thank you guys for coming and engaging this conversation. Please do the survey, but we will continue. We will be continuing to dialogue for at least 15, 20 more minutes. So go ahead, Mike. Sorry.
Sure. No, that's no problem. That's important information. I think, you know, we've been part of the conversation in New York on offshore wind for a long time. So why now? Why is it really important now to New York? We were, you know, one of the last states in the Mid-Atlantic to really move into a goal. And why is our goal so big rather? It's because offshore wind is really the next best way to get utility scale renewable energy into the grid. When you look at New York and you consider that New York is its own electrical grid, a lot of the renewable energy that we have right now, and people forget a lot of it is hydropower coming from Niagara, a lot of renewable energy from onshore wind and other sources is hitting congestion on its way to the downstate demand. And what offshore wind does is it provides us with the energy where it's needed, where it's used. And so the energy losses, I would say, you know, and I'm not a grid technician, so I can't give you the exact technical explanation, but I know enough to know that the energy losses from congestion are significant enough that offshore wind really is the way to go for New York. It doesn't mean we don't want to do solar. It doesn't mean we can't. We do need an all of the above approach, but offshore wind for us just makes so much sense given its proximity to the demand centers. What challenges we really have are more, you know, our grid was built where Long Island is at the end of the system, not the beginning. So we have to kind of re-engineer some of our grid in order to accept this huge amount of energy into places that typically were, you know, at the end of the line, not the beginning. So that's kind of the New York perspective on that.
Great. I'm going to move this question, and I apologize for my dogs. But this is to Matt, and specifically about workforce. And Judy was talking about the Coastal Society has career development program. You know, in addition to working on the environmental impact assessments, where do you envision the employment growth areas for our marine scientists? And also there was another comment as well as prioritizing, you know, women to engage in construction and operation and other sectors in the community. Are there efforts to diversify and to build capacity within all aspects of the supply chain?
Yeah, there are. The workforce component of offshore wind is a really important one because there are such specific training requirements to be able to work offshore. So there is an organization that's supported by the major developers primarily called the Global Wind Organization, and they certify offshore wind technicians for a variety of safety and technical standards. So it's kind of, there's almost a race among East Coast states to be a leader in workforce training, but it's definitely realized that workforce along, you know, I talked about some bottlenecks and that workforce can be one of those too. I think we'll see people that have competency working offshore in the Gulf of Mexico coming to the East Coast. So really, I think I'll say that workforce is something that is emphasized, and the state of Virginia, along with Maryland and North Carolina, have stood up something called the Mid-Atlantic Wind Training Alliance, and so that's getting off the ground. It's a consortium that'll be providing training across several different community colleges in Virginia, at least. So a lot of effort being put around workforce development.
Are there efforts to diversify the workforce, opportunities for women or different communities?
So I don't know of anything specifically about opportunities geared towards women. I know that at least the law that kind of the enabling legislation in Virginia that set our goal and codified that goal to have 5.2 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2034 focuses on making sure that disadvantaged communities are kind of included in the economic opportunity and education needs around offshore wind. So that's probably the most specific answer I can give to that.
Great. Mike, do you have anything to add to that? And again, Judy was also talking about marine scientists. So we want to make sure we're including marine scientists and different diverse communities?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And, back to the earlier question, about the research, I think there's a whole new field out there that's just starting here in this region related to offshore wind. And I think, it's not just revolving around some of the impacts. It's also, as Matt was saying, it's related to the engineering. We're fortunate in New York to have a few really dedicated trade schools, including the Merchant Marine Academy. I've actually presented there as a guest lecturer, which doesn't really qualify me for anything other than being able to say that. And I did because they're interested. They know it's coming and they want to be part of the jobs and not just part of the impacts. And so, yeah, it starts now. It starts, with our SUNY Maritime colleagues downstate and trying to make sure that students are aware of the opportunities, whether they're, marine architect or whether they're an engineer or whether they're a resource scientist. The need is just, only growing, and I would expect it to only grow exponentially. And back to the earlier question about, the supply chain, I think there continues to be so much demand. And that demand continues to only grow exponentially that, I really see this as being a real opportunity, for the coming decades for students. I think we're just sort of scratching the surface right now.
Great. Are there any other, again, I'm looking at the chat. I feel like we've answered many of those. Again, we're a smaller group now. Does anyone want to show their face or Tom Bigford, I know we can always count on you for a good question. Does anyone have a question? I have another one, but love to hear from you guys. There we go, Tom.
I've got one.
All right.
I just wonder regionally, how does the work that you were talking about today, like Southern New England and Mid-Atlantic, how does that compare to elsewhere around the country? Like in the Gulf of Mexico and the West Coast?
Mike, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I think we and I'm gonna claim New England. That's the benefit of being in New York. I can claim New England sometimes. We really were at the sort of forefront. I think particularly Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and look, I mean, you learn the lessons the hard way too. But I think from the standpoint of getting out the gate, and really what drives these conversations as much as anything is having those firm targets. And that's when things got real for New York, is when we had, all right, we're going after 9 gigawatts. I mean, we really got to get going. Before then, it was mostly planning and sort of identifying areas. And I think a lot of the other regions are kind of at that place. The thing that really drives it as much as anything for our region is dollars and cents. It's electrical prices. And we had developers coming to us when I first got to New York, over 12 years ago now, who were making arguments not really based on renewables, although they did make that argument too, but saying, our margins are like right there when it comes to being competitive with a lot of the other power generation in New York. And I think that's unlike other places to the south and in the Gulf, where they really do have much lower energy costs, at least from an electrical standpoint. You see it on the West Coast. I think they have challenges related to some of the bathymetry there and the technology limitations, but I'd expect them to start coming along, a little more quickly. Otherwise, I mean, Hawaii would have been the first one out of the gate given their energy prices. So I think it's a combination of factors. The states have to be willing, have to have the aggressive targets. I think the economics have to make sense so that from a ratepayer standpoint and from a development standpoint, you can make a go of it. But then ultimately, it's just about continuing to move forward and getting a critical mass of energy. And I think that's where that regional scale really plays to our benefit, having New England and the Mid-Atlantic collectively with 26 gigawatts. That's what allows us to have conversations about supply chain and jobs and workforce development.
Can I ask a follow-up, Jen?
Sure.
How about regional ocean planning? How has that been an aid in getting this going together regionally?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that one, but certainly Matt and Laurie, if you have anything to add, please do. I've been very involved in the regional ocean planning effort for New York and the Mid-Atlantic and sort of honorary ex officio for New England. And I think, the part that we play has really been on the information exchange. So much of this is new. Getting back to those communities at different scales. Yes, the states are in competition with each other at some level, but at some level, we're all trying to figure this out together. And I think the regional partnerships are those opportunities for us to interface with each other in kind of a more neutral way, in a more peer-to-peer kind of way, and also to bring along some of our federal partners. And it's certainly really important for us not just to be talking to our peer states, but also to be talking to BOEM, talking to NOAA, talking to the Corps, figuring out how we're going to use the information. And I think the real success that the regional ocean partnerships can point to are not just our planning efforts, but the way that we're providing information on things like our regional portals. So in the Mid-Atlantic, we know our portal's being used by developers, and they can trust it because the states have weighed in, the feds have weighed in, it's accepted data, it's used data, and they know that when they give it to us in a permit application, or they give it to us in NEPA documentation, they can say, we got it off of the Marco portal, and we'll know that we can trust it too. So I think, establishing that dialogue and having that buy-in, data is always a safe place to start, but it's always an important place to continue the conversation. So I'd look forward for that to, continue to evolve and grow over time.
Matt, do you have any thoughts on responding to some of those questions? The growth in other parts of the country, for example?
I don't have a whole lot to add to that, other than I think there's just an interesting insight that the types of offshore wind projects will likely be different in other parts of the country. When we identify new lease areas off the East Coast, they'll probably be floating projects. And it's thought that that projects off the West Coast will be floating projects as well. So it goes back to one of Mike's points about the technology changing so quickly that it's enabling us to take advantage of this resource. So that's mainly the extent that I've been involved in regional planning and can kind of answer that question.
And Laurie, what about from your perspective as a consultant? Have you guys been hiring because of the growth of this industry and your expertise, or what have you seen?
I think yes, and actually, Steve might want to talk about this a little bit too. We've been challenged because of things that are new and some of the special needs that we have to focus on different aspects of the environmental impacts of these much larger projects, as Mike was talking about. But I think, definitely what you saw, I think, from all of our presentations is there is a lot of research that's going into this. There's a lot of thought, a lot of people working on these projects. And as Mike was saying, that's just going to continue to grow as we collect that information, as we use it. But it is nice to know that you have this big reservoir of information, and we will continue to build the reservoir of talent as well to talk about these subjects and to make sure that they get evaluated the way they need to be.
Great. Good. Does anyone have any other questions? Does any panelist have a question for another panelist? Steve, you're kind of raising your hand. Go for it.
Matt, I was wondering, you were talking about the economic studies that were done and the potential for increases in jobs serving the sector. Did those studies also touch on the potential offset of any local or regional jobs given the transfer of power? And is that still a net benefit that is coming out of those studies?
Yeah, so I'm not an economist and have only read them, but I know I'm recalling the Kitty Hawk study did kind of incorporate some sort of like displacement factor of like, if will we be creating a net benefit because there won't be jobs in some other area, and they did still find that net benefit to be the case. The other thing that's interesting, and it's not directly an answer to your question, but the types of, I think what we're concerned about in Hampton Roads is that the types of workers that'll be needed to work on, onshore and offshore are in high demand elsewhere. Kind of, they're building infrastructure, building ships. So I think we're a little more worried about having enough workers to make sure that we can support the industry.
Yeah, I would add, Steve, that to that point, cross-training and kind of retraining some of those vocational skills is really important. New York has set up an offshore wind training institute. We're expecting to see upwards of 10,000 jobs, and that's going to require a lot of skilled labor and a lot of folks who have very specialized expertise. So I think, Matt's point is right on. There's already, I don't want to call it a shortage, but there's already a demand for that kind of specialized expertise. And there's opportunities for people who have, electrical expertise to get trained on specific offshore wind types of jobs too, where they're kind of transitioning into the marine environment. So some of that kind of cross training, as well as just bringing new people into the job market, I think is really important, and certainly an area of focus for New York, but also for a lot of states, like Matt was saying.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, all panelists. Really great job. Really thoughtful responses. Really enjoyed this dialogue and the opportunity to moderate you all and to contribute to the Coastal Society. So there will be future webinars. They will be announced later on. And I think we're going to adjourn right now. Steve, do you want to take us out?
Sure, I'll say thanks to you, Jen, as well as our panelists, Matt, Mike, and Laurie, for your time and insights today. We did choose this topic to recognize how the offshore wind is more than something that is figuratively and literally on the horizon way out there. It's so I appreciate your help in recognizing the local and regional coastal community effects. And also thanks to all those who joined today and the great range of questions and comments. This type of dialogue certainly helps us move towards a better informed set of solutions for the offshore wind build out. That's it. Have a good weekend, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for organizing this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.